Christian nuns in the medieval and early modern periods lived. Lives shaped by strict discipline, isolation, and spiritual devotion. From a young age, many were placed in convents where the outside world slowly faded away, replaced by prayer, silence, and service to God. Their days followed a rigid rhythm: dawn prayers, communal work, scripture reading, and long hours of contemplation. The convent was not merely a residence, it was believed to be a sacred barrier separating holiness from the corruption of the world. For these women, taking vows meant surrendering personal identity, family ties, and earthly ambitions in exchange for spiritual purpose and divine protection. They believed that even in times of war, their sacred status would shield them from harm. However, history shows that war rarely respects sanctity. As the Ottoman Empire expanded into Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and parts of Central Europe, its armies moved through regions dotted with Christian monasteries and convents that had existed for centuries. These religious institutions were often located outside city walls or in quiet rural areas, making them especially vulnerable. Unlike fortified castles or garrison towns, convents relied on the belief that no army would dare violate holy ground. This belief was rooted in earlier medieval traditions where religious spaces were sometimes spared out of respect or fear of divine punishment. But imperial warfare, driven by conquest, resources, and political dominance, followed a different logic. For Ottoman commanders, monasteries and convents were not neutral spaces. They were symbols of an opposing faith and part of the cultural identity of enemy territories. In the mindset of conquest, such places represented ideological resistance as much as military weakness. When an army advanced, it viewed the land in terms of what could be taken, controlled, or neutralized. Religious buildings often contained wealth in the form of gold, silver vessels, land deeds, and food stores. Even when nuns lived in poverty, the convent itself was assumed to hold valuables donated over generations. This made these institutions targets long before soldiers ever reached city centers. The nuns themselves were painfully unprepared for violence. Most had never seen armed men outside of ceremonial processions. Their education rarely included survival skills, and many had been taught to accept suffering as part of spiritual devotion. When rumors of advancing armies reached convent walls, panic spread quietly. Some prayed harder, believing divine intervention would save them. Others wrote final letters to family members or chronicled their fears in secret journals. A few convent leaders attempted to negotiate with local authorities for protection, but resources were limited and priorities lay with defending cities, not isolated religious communities. As Ottoman forces approached, the fragile illusion of safety collapsed. Soldiers moving through newly conquered land often acted quickly, driven by orders, discipline, or sometimes chaos following battle. Convents encountered troops who did not share their religious worldview and did not recognize their vows as sacred. The language barrier further intensified fear. Nuns could not communicate, plead, or explain their status, their habits, crosses. And prayers meant nothing to soldiers, trained to see conquest as destiny and resistance as weakness. Many accounts from European chroniclers describe the moment of confrontation as deeply traumatic. Doors that had been closed to the world for decades were suddenly forced open. Sacred silence was broken by unfamiliar voices, armor, and commands. The shock alone was devastating. For women who had lived behind walls of ritual and routine, the intrusion felt apocalyptic. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others thought it was the end of the world foretold in Scripture. The psychological terror often struck before any physical suffering occurred. What made this experience especially cruel was the collapse of meaning. The nuns' entire lives had been built on the belief that devotion offered protection. Renouncing the world placed them closer to God and therefore beyond worldly cruelty. When that belief shattered, it left a spiritual wound deeper than any physical harm. Chroniclers later wrote that many nuns experienced profound despair, questioning their faith and the justice of God. This inner conflict rarely appears in military histories but was central to the trauma they endured. It is important to understand that these events did not occur in isolation or as rare exceptions. They were part of a broader pattern of warfare in which civilian religious communities were caught between empires. The Ottomans were not unique in violating religious spaces. Christian armies had done the same in other regions. However, for the nuns living under Ottoman expansion, the experience was particularly devastating because it struck at the core of their identity. They were not warriors, nobles, or political actors. They were women who had deliberately removed themselves from history only to be violently pulled back into it. Another layer of tea. Tragedy lies in how these women were perceived afterward. Even when they survived, returning to Christian society was often impossible. Convents that were destroyed were rarely rebuilt quickly, and displaced nuns had nowhere to go. Worse still, suspicion followed them. In deeply religious societies, purity and honor were closely tied to a woman's worth. Survivors often faced silence, judgment, or isolation rather than compassion. This meant that many stories were never recorded, either because the women were unable to speak or because society did not want to listen. The scarcity of direct testimony has allowed these events to fade into vague references rather than detailed accounts. What we know comes mostly from letters, church records, and second-hand chronicles, written by men who were often far removed from the actual suffering. This absence of voices makes the tragedy even darker. These women lived, feared, prayed, and suffered. Yet history remembers them only as nameless figures caught in conquest. Their individual lives were erased along with the walls of their convents' understanding. This section of history is not about assigning simple blame or fueling hatred. It is about recognizing how imperial expansion, religious conflict, and gender combined to produce silent victims. The story of Christian nuns during Ottoman conquests reminds us that war does not only destroy armies and cities, it dismantles belief systems, identities, and entire ways of life. Their suffering existed in the shadows, overshadowed by grand narratives of empire, victory, and defeat. When modern audiences hear about empires, they often imagine maps changing colors or rulers signing treaties. Rarely do they picture the quiet rooms of a convent, the trembling hands clutching prayer beads, or the moment when faith collided with violence. Yet it is in these hidden spaces that the true cost of history is revealed. The lives of these nuns show how easily sanctity can be ignored when power advances, and how those who seek peace are often the least protected when war arrives, or as Ottoman armies advanced through contested Christian territory. The fate of convents followed a grim and predictable pattern. These religious institutions were not random casualties of war. They were deliberately approached as part of the conquest process. Convents often stood near trade routes, fertile lands, or the outskirts of cities, locations chosen centuries earlier for peace and seclusion. Ironically, these same qualities made them easy targets. Lacking walls, guards, or weapons, they offered little resistance. When cities fell, soldiers frequently spread outward, sweeping through surrounding areas to secure resources and eliminate potential threats. In this phase of conquest, convents were among the first places encountered. To the invading forces, a convent was not merely a house of prayer. It was a building, land, and property belonging to the defeated population. Imperial warfare at the TI operated on the assumption that victory granted rights over everything within the conquered territory. This included crops, livestock, buildings, and people. Religious neutrality held little meaning in this system. While some commanders enforced discipline, chaos was common in the aftermath of sieges, especially when soldiers were allowed to claim spoils as part of their reward. In such moments, sacred status offered no protection. Historical records describe how convent doors were broken open and interiors searched thoroughly. Altars were overturned, storage rooms emptied, and living quarters stripped bare. Even the most modest convents possessed items accumulated over generations: chalices, candlesticks, embroidered vestments, handwritten manuscripts, and food reserves meant to sustain the community through winter. These objects were valuable not only materially but symbolically. Their destruction represented the erasure of religious presence from the land. For the nuns watching this unfold, it was the violent dismantling of a world they believed eternal. The psychological shock of this invasion cannot be overstated. Many nuns had entered convents as children and spent decades within the same walls. The routines of religious life created a sense of timelessness, a belief that the outside world was distant and secondary. When armed men entered these spaces, shouting orders in unfamiliar languages, that illusion shattered instantly. Fear spread not only from what was happening, but from the complete loss of control. These women were trained to obey spiritual authority, not military force, and the sudden shift was overwhelming. Chronicler. Note that some convent leaders attempted to assert their religious status, presenting symbols of faith or invoking divine law. These gestures often failed, not always due to cruelty, but because the invaders did not recognize the same religious framework. In many cases, soldiers viewed these institutions as extensions of the enemy's power structure. Destroying them was seen as both practical and ideological. Removing religious centers weakened local resistance and sent a clear message that the old order was gone. Once looted, convents were frequently repurposed. Some were turned into military quarters, storage facilities, or administrative buildings. Others were abandoned, left in ruins as soldiers moved on. For the nuns, this meant immediate displacement. With no resources, no protection, and often no clear destination, they were forced into uncertainty. Groups were separated, older members left behind, younger ones taken away. The breaking apart of these communities was one of the most devastating consequences, as convent life was built on collective identity rather than individual survival. The removal of nuns from the convents marked a transition from sacred life to captivity. They were no longer seen as religious figures, but as part of the conquered population. Their habits, once symbols of devotio, now offered no protection and sometimes even made them targets of ridicule or hostility. In the brutal hierarchy of war, vulnerability attracted exploitation. The loss of their physical sanctuary mirrored the loss of social status, reducing them to anonymous figures swept along by the machinery of empire. What makes this section of history especially dark is the silence that followed. Many of these events were intentionally omitted from official records. Ottoman military chronicles focused on victories, treaties, and governance, not the suffering of religious captives. On the Christian side, church authorities often avoided detailed discussion of what happened to nuns, fearing scandal or moral panic. As a result, much of what we know comes from fragmented accounts, letters, and indirect references that hint at events without fully describing them. This silence was not accidental. It was shaped by shame, fear, and social constraints. In deeply religious societies, the violation or displacement of nuns challenged the moral order. A woman who had taken vows was expected to remain untouched by the world. When that expectation was broken, society often responded by erasing the story rather than confronting it. Survivors were sometimes encouraged to remain silent, their experiences treated as something to forget rather than understand. The destruction of convents also had long-term cultural consequences. These institutions were centers of learning, charity, and record-keeping. They preserved manuscripts, taught local children, and provided aid to the poor. Their removal created gaps in education and social support that lasted generations. In many regions, the loss of convents marked the end of female-led religious and intellectual life. This absence is visible in historical records as sudden breaks in documentation, where voices that once contributed quietly to society simply disappear. It is important to approach this history with nuance. Not every Ottoman soldier acted with the same level of brutality, and not every convent suffered the same fate. There were instances where communities were spared or protected under specific agreements. However, these exceptions do not erase the broader pattern. The systematic vulnerability of convents during conquest reveals how war disproportionately harms those who lack power, especially women who exist outside political and military structures. The transformation of sacred spaces into targets highlights a recurring theme in history. When empires expand, symbolism becomes a battlefield. Destroying or occupying religious institutions is not only about material gain, but about asserting dominance over belief systems. For the nuns, whose lives revolved around spiritual meaning, this assault on their environment was an assault on their identity. Their faith did not disappear, but it was forced to exist in exile, stripped of the structures that had sustained it. Modern discussions of empire often focus on strat, age, leadership, and legacy. Rarely do they dwell on the quiet devastation left behind in places like convents. Yet these stories matter because they reveal the human cost hidden beneath grand narratives. The nuns who watched their convents looted and destroyed experienced history, not as a series of events, but as the sudden collapse of everything familiar. Their suffering reminds us that conquest is never abstract. It is lived, moment by moment, by those who are least equipped to survive it. By examining how convents became targets, we uncover a darker truth about warfare, that sanctity is fragile and moral boundaries dissolve quickly under the pressure of power. The destruction of these religious spaces was not just collateral damage. It was a calculated part of reshaping conquered lands. In that process, countless lives were uprooted, identities erased, and voices silenced. Their stories linger at the edges of history, waiting to be acknowledged not as footnotes, but as essential parts of the past. For many nuns who survived the initial invasion and destruction of the convents, the ordeal did not end with displacement. Instead, it entered a new and often more psychologically devastating phase, captivity. Once removed from their religious communities, these women were absorbed into the vast system of prisoners created by imperial warfare. In this system, identity was stripped away and replaced with a single reality. They now belong to the conqueror. Their former lives, as spiritual devotees, held no legal or social weight. They were counted, transported, and redistributed like other captives taken during war. Captivity was not a single, uniform experience. Some nuns were taken in small groups, others separated and sent in different directions. The journey itself was often traumatic. Forced marches over long distances exposed them to hunger, exhaustion, illness, and constant fear. Many had lived sheltered lives, unaccustomed to physical hardship. The sudden exposure to harsh travel conditions broke bodies and spirits alike. Along the way, they witnessed the suffering of other captives, women, children, and elderly people, creating a shared atmosphere of despair that erased any lingering sense of safety. Once captivity began, the question of survival dominated every thought. Nuns had been trained to think in terms of eternity, salvation, and sacrifice, not daily survival under threat. Now they were forced to adapt quickly or perish. Their religious clothing was often removed or replaced, a symbolic act that severed them from their former identity. This was not merely practical, it was psychological. By stripping away visible signs of faith, captors erased the markers that distinguished these women as consecrated individuals. They became anonymous captives, their past reduced to something irrelevant or inconvenient. Forced conversion emerged as a recurring pressure in captivity. While not universal, it was a reality many faced, especially those held for extended periods. Conversion was often presented not as a spiritual choice, but as a condition tied to survival, improved treatment, or escape from harsher forms of servitude. For women who had taken lifelong vows, this demand created an unbearable internal conflict. Their faith was not a private belief, but the foundation of their entire existence. To abandon it felt like the destruction of the self. The psychological torment of this pressure cannot be overstated. Chroniclers describe captives who resisted conversion, enduring prolonged suffering, while others, broken by fear and exhaustion, complied outwardly to survive. This created deep internal wounds. Those who converted under duress often carried lifelong guilt and shame, even when their choice had been made under extreme coercion. In religious societies, faith was tied to honor, and the loss of it, voluntary or not, was seen as a moral collapse. Rather than a human response to terror, servitude became another defining feature of captivity. Many nuns were assigned to domestic labor, where their lives revolved around obedience, silence, and constant monitoring. While this may appear less violent than battlefield brutality, it represented a slow erasure of autonomy. Every action, from waking to sleeping, was controlled by others. For women who had chosen a life of obedience to God, being forced into obedience to strangers carried a cruel irony. Their vows were no longer sacred commitments, but tools used against them. What made this experience particularly devastating was the loss of community. Convent life was communal by design. Prayer, meals, work, and silence were shared experiences that reinforced identity and resilience. In captivity, nuns were often isolated from one another. This separation weakened resistance and intensified despair. Without familiar faces or shared rituals, many struggled to maintain a sense of who they were. Loneliness became a form of punishment, slowly dismantling the inner strength that faith once provided. The concept of time also changed in captivity. Religious life followed a structured calendar marked by feast days, fasts, and prayer hours. Captivity erased this rhythm. Days blurred together, defined only by labor and fear. Without religious markers to measure time, many captives described a sense of being suspended in endless uncertainty. This temporal disorientation deepened psychological trauma, making it harder to imagine an end to suffering or a return to normalcy. Some captives attempted to preserve fragments of their faith in secret. Silent prayers, remembered scripture, and internal rituals became acts of resistance. These private practices were risky, as discovery could result in punishment. Yet they provided a fragile link to former identity. Faith, once practiced openly and collectively, was reduced to whispers in the mind. This transformation illustrates how captivity not only controlled bodies, but also reshaped spiritual life, forcing a leaf into hidden Internal spaces, the fate of those converted, whether sincerely or under coercion, was complex. Conversion did not guarantee freedom or safety. Many remained in servitude, their new religious identity failing to protect them fully. At the same time, conversion often severed any remaining hope of returning to their former communities. Christian societies rarely accepted converted nuns back, even when they had acted under threat. This left many women trapped between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Those who resisted conversion faced different challenges. Their refusal was sometimes admired in later religious narratives, but during captivity it often meant harsher treatment. Resistance required extraordinary mental strength, especially when combined with isolation and physical hardship. Not all could endure it indefinitely. This reality complicates simplistic notions of heroism. Survival choices made under extreme pressure do not fit neatly into moral categories, yet historical narratives often judge them harshly. The long-term effects of captivity extended far beyond the period of confinement. Survivors carried deep psychological scars that influenced the rest of their lives. Trauma manifested as silence, withdrawal, or intense religiosity. Some sought to return to convent life if possible, hoping to reclaim a sense of order and meaning. Others could not reintegrate, haunted by memories and internal conflict. Their experiences were rarely acknowledged, jailed openly, leaving them to process trauma alone. The historical record reflects this discomfort. Official documents often reduced captives to numbers or vague references. Personal stories were minimized or erased. This absence is telling. It reveals how society struggled to confront the reality of what happened to these women. Acknowledging their suffering required acknowledging vulnerability, coercion, and moral ambiguity subjects that challenged rigid religious and cultural frameworks. Understanding captivity and forced conversion is essential to grasping the full scope of this dark history. It was not merely about physical domination, but about reshaping identity. Empire did not only conquer land, it sought to reorder belief, loyalty, and social structure. For nuns, whose lives were defined by faith and separation from worldly power, this reordering was especially violent. Their captivity represented the collision between spiritual devotion and imperial ambition. This chapter of history forces us to reconsider how we define loss. The destruction of buildings and communities is visible and measurable. The loss of identity, faith, and inner stability is harder to quantify, but equally devastating. The nuns who endured captivity lost not only their freedom, but the framework through which they understood existence. Their suffering unfolded quietly, away from battlefields and treaties, in private struggle that history rarely records. By examining this experience closely, we uncover the human cost hidden beneath narratives of conquest and expansion. These women were not passive symbols. They were individuals navigating impossible choices under relentless pressure. Their stories remind us that history's darkest moments are often lived in silence, where survival itself becomes a moral battlefield and faith is tested not by belief alone, but by the will to endure when everything sacred is taken away. The final tragedy surrounding these women did not end with invasion, captivity, or even survival. It continued quietly long after the armies moved on, in the form of silence. This silence was not accidental. It was constructed by fear, shame, social pressure, and the deliberate priorities of history itself. For those who lived through the destruction of convents and the loss of their formalized, speaking openly about what had happened was often impossible. Their suffering existed in a world that had no language willing to receive it. In deeply religious societies, nuns occupied a unique and fragile position. They were expected to embody purity, spiritual strength, and moral perfection. When violence disrupted that image, society struggled to reconcile reality with expectation. Survivors did not return as heroes. Instead, many returned to suspicion, discomfort, or outright rejection. Their experiences challenged the idealized vision of religious life. Rather than confronting that challenge, communities often chose silence. What could not be expiated, land was simply ignored. Church authorities faced an uncomfortable dilemma. Acknowledging the full extent of what happened to nuns during conquest risked scandal and moral panic. Religious institutions relied heavily on the perception of sanctity and divine protection. To admit that consecrated women had been violated, displaced, or forced into impossible choices was to admit vulnerability. As a result, official records often softened language or avoided detail altogether. Trauma was reduced to vague phrases, if mentioned at all, This erasure had profound consequences. Without acknowledgement, survivors were denied validation. Their pain was not publicly recognized, and their voices were not preserved. Many were encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to forget. Silence became a form of obedience, framed as humility or spiritual endurance. In reality, it was another burden placed on women who had already lost everything familiar. The cost of survival became lifelong invisibility, the shame attached. True, their experiences was not always spoken, but it was deeply felt. Even when no accusation was made, survivors sensed that their presence unsettled others. They were reminders of a reality that contradicted comforting beliefs about faith and protection. Some women internalized this shame, believing they had failed spiritually, even when their suffering was beyond their control. This internal conflict often led to withdrawal, intense self-blame, or rigid religiosity as a means of coping. Over time, these individual silences accumulated into historical absence. Chronicles of empire focused on battles, leaders, and treaties. Religious histories emphasized martyrs and miracles. The quiet suffering of nuns did not fit neatly into either category. They were neither triumphant nor publicly heroic. Their endurance occurred in private, marked by loss rather than victory. As a result, their stories slipped through the cracks of historical memory when historians later attempted to reconstruct these events. They encountered gaps that could not be filled easily. Records ended abruptly. Letters hinted at tragedy without explanation. Convents vanished from documentation as if they had never existed. This absence itself tells a story. It reveals how power determines memory and how certain lives are deemed unworthy preservation. The forgotten nature of these women is not a coincidence. It is the result of deliberate neglect shaped by cultural discomfort. The broader consequences of this silence extended beyond individuals. Entire communities lost sources of education, charity, and spiritual leadership. Convents were not isolated spiritual bubbles. They were woven into social life. Nuns taught children, cared for the sick, preserved texts, and supported the poor. Their disappearance created voids that were felt quietly but deeply. In many regions, female religious influence faded for generations, altering the social fabric in ways that were never fully acknowledged. Digidi. Silence also distorted historical understanding. Without these voices, narratives of conquest became one-dimensional. Empires were judged by efficiency and longevity rather than human cost. Religious conflicts were framed as ideological struggles instead of lived catastrophes. The absence of women's experiences, particularly those outside traditional family roles, skewed perceptions of the past. History became louder but less truthful for the survivors themselves. Time did not heal in the way society expected. Trauma lingered in memory, dreams, and behavior. Some women attempted to rebuild religious lives, finding solace in prayer and structure. Others withdrew from communal life entirely, unable to reconcile faith with what they had endured. Their responses varied, but the common thread was isolation. Without public acknowledgement, healing became a solitary struggle. Generations later, descendants and scholars began to sense that something was missing. Questions arose about vanished convents and sudden breaks in female religious history. Slowly, through careful examination of fragmented sources, a darker picture emerged. These discoveries did not bring justice, but they restored visibility. To name suffering is not to undo it, but it prevents complete erasure. Remembering these women is not about reopening wounds or assigning simplistic blame. It is about confronting the reality that history often celebrates power while ignoring vulnerability. The silence surrounding these nuns reveals how societies protect comforting narratives at the expense of truth. Their forgotten lives challenge us to ask whose suffering is remembered and whose is dismissed. In acknowledging this silence, we also confront a broader truth about historical memory. What survives is often what serves authority, pride, or ideology. What disappears is what complicates those stories. The experiences of these nuns complicated narratives of divine protection, moral certainty, and imperial glory. That complexity made them inconvenient, and inconvenience leads to forgetting. Yet silence is never complete. It leaves traces, ruins without explanation, records that stop mid-sentence, traditions that fade without reason. These traces are invitations to look closer, to listen for voices history tried to mute. When we do, we begin to understand that the past is not only shaped by what is recorded, but by what is deliberately left out. The forgotten suffering of these women reminds us that the darkest chapters of history are not always written in blood on battlefields. Sometimes they unfold quietly in lives lived without witnesses, in pain carried without acknowledgement. To remember them now is not to rewrite history, but to complete it. Their silence, once enforced, can finally be broken not by sensationalism, but by recognition, empathy, and truth.